Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Capital Consumption Theory. I'm here with Brian Winters, and today we are going to be talking about cycles, specifically the capital consumption cycle and maybe also some other cycles if we get into that. So uh, to understand the capital consumption theory, the capital consumption cycle, I will start off with sort of the background. Refer everybody to dynamical systems, um, and if you've ever had like sort of uh, a, a partial differential equations class in college, or a computational math, all which sounds very might sound intimidating, but it's actually quite intuitive. So there is a famous equation called the predator-prey equation, and it is essentially where you're looking at two species in the wild, which is one is a predator and it eats the prey. So like, like wolves and deer, or something of this nature. And if you set up equations to describe what is going to happen over time, you'll find these dynamics where, for example, if there's a relatively low number of the prey species, so if there's a relatively low number of deer, then what's going to happen is that the deer that are alive are going to have sort of an easier time of it because they will have a lot of food available relative to how many there are. And so they will tend to grow in population. As they grow in population, then when the population goes up, then the predator species will also start growing because they're having a larger and larger food supply, so their population goes up and eventually reach a peak, because as the predators species goes up, then they are preying on the prey, so the prey have a higher likelihood to be eaten. And then also as the population goes up, then they have a harder time finding enough food because the food is limited. So eventually you reach a peak where those two things cause the population to decline again. After the prey population declines, then the predator population, like the wolves, for example, also then they start having trouble because they don't have as much enough food to eat. So then their population goes down. And then after the prey population goes down and the predator population goes down, then you're back to the start of the cycle where you have a low prey population and there's not as many predators, feeding on them, and they have lots of food, and so their population goes up again. So you can actually model this and get this type of a sort of a dynamic of oscillations over time, based on the relations of these variables to each other, what those different things cause to happen, as I just described. And this has been empirically seen. Like they actually do see these, when they graph the population of deer and wolves over time, they have found these relationships to actually exist in nature, where you're getting cyclical oscillations of both populations, with the prey population leading. This here is the data from an experiment, and somebody put like some type of mite. They use some type of mite, these little bugs, and another type. And I don't know what Typhlodomus occidentalis is, but something that eats them, I guess. And they get that in the lab. And they have these oscillations of the two populations, with one tending to follow the predator population, tending to lag the prey population oscillations. So there is work by Peter Turchin, which is very interesting. His book Secular Cycles, specifically the work about pre-1800. His book Secular Cycles, I find that interesting and convincing. And the dynamic, although Peter, I think he tries to stay away from So the dynamic that in the secular cycles pre 1800 is basically Malthusian. So Malthusian, the idea is that the human population can grow much faster. Well, pre 1800 it can grow quite fast. And pre 1800, the carrying capacity of society, the amount of food that you can grow on a certain amount of land, is actually relatively fixed. And so what will tend to happen is that, as the population grows, there will be relatively less food available for everyone as you reach the limits of capacity. And so eventually you start getting to where the population has trouble getting enough to eat. They're not very healthy. And so you tend to get like epidemics and plagues around this time. And you also, because this tends to engender a lot of conflict, you also tend to have wars. So you have like these these things which drive the population down again. And then after it goes down, then everything gets better, and then it can go up again. Most people have probably heard about Malthus. But what I've never heard before, never thought about before I read, Peter Turchin's books, is that there's actually, you could actually analyze that economically, that hypothetically you would expect, and this is what Peter Turchin points out, that when you have the population going up, what you're getting is sort of more scarcity of food. So you would expect food prices to actually rise. And you also have more labor available. So you'd actually expect labor prices, wages to actually go down. You have more people that need a place to live and a place to farm. So rents go up. And so you have, potentially this sort of economic aspect of Malthusian dynamics. And then Peter Turchin actually turns that into, when you look at sort of the general population and what he calls the elites, and I would call like capitalists, but pre 1800 that would be like landowners basically. The wealthy actually do really well when the population is doing really poorly. The rents are high, the food prices, which is what they sell as landowners, is high, and labor prices are low. Now this may be like not necessarily it may be like a feudal economy and not a market economy. So the rent may be like how much food do the peasants have to turn over to the aristocrat, as the rent. But the same supply dynamics sort of apply. And so he actually does something which actually looks kind of similar. So the aristocrats do well when everybody else is not doing so well. But after a while, everybody else does not do as well. And I'm very much, it's a whole book, and I'm like just how do you say, mangling Peter Turchin's ideas. Hopefully he doesn't hear this because he'll be upset at how mangled this version is. But the basic idea, and he doesn't talk about the predator-prey equations, but reading his stuff, that just exactly reminded me of the predator-prey equations. And what he describes does have that dynamic where, as you get to the peak of the cycle where there's a lot of population, the elites do well, and people are very much incentivized to try to climb that ladder and become an elite. So eventually the population starts to decline later, and then the elites also tend to sort of like go to war with each other. You have all this conflict, and then the population like crashes, and then you have a cycle again.
So in your analogy here, the elites
Yep.
are the predators.
Yeah, and obviously they don't actually
the
eat people or anything, but and I'm trying, I'm not making that certainly would lend itself to like certain a certain style of socialist would just love this type of analogy. I'm trying not to make a moral analogy here, but in the sense that increasing population numbers will drive up the price for food. It will drive the price of rent up, and will drive the price of labor down. I do think that mathematically that analogy holds. And it's all, it's very sort of, how would you say, like morbid or something, to think about human populations this way, because we're talking about, massive suffering. But, if you sort of, put that to the side and look at it mathematically, like what will happen, what will the factors be, and what will the behavior of the system be? I think that is what it looks like. This is a graph here from his book, and he's looking, this one is from 1450 to 1800. So in the second half, you're actually starting to get increased agricultural productivity and increased wheat yield. So the carrying capacity is actually going up. That's the dotted line here. This is the population. And if you normalize that so that you sort of like flatten this top part and just look at population compared to the carrying capacity, then you get this you get this sort of peak here, and this is a flattening of population growth, but relative to capacity, it's actually moving downwards. Okay, so
Where
if you
does this
flatten
data
over
come
here,
from, Eddie? Is this
this
the
is from Peter.
population of Europe or the world,
Yeah,
or
this
what
is
is it?
I think this was either France or England.
Okay, so just one
Yeah.
country.
Yeah, one country. And so this is the population pressure in the lower graph, and then he graphs inverse wage here. So it is the like sort of like how many hours do you have to work to feed yourself, basically, the inverse real wage. Instead of money per hour, it's like money, it's like hours per money or hours per food. And the inverse wage, does indeed follow the population pressure quite well. That's that.
And sorry, what's
Um,
the definition of population pressure in that chart? Like, what is that?
I would have
That
to
translated?
look in. I don't have that in my head. I'd have to look at the book. I'm happy to send you that book if you want
No,
to.
I just no, I'm curious how do you calculate the pressure of the population? Like, what are the factors that go into that? Like scarcity of food or living
Yeah.
spaces, or
I would suspect that what he did was actually he took the population in this first graph and then he
uh-huh.
divided that by the carrying capacity, which is the dotted line here.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah, all right, that looks, yeah, okay,
looked about
thanks.
right. Yeah. Peter Turchin has these ideas about history that, history is like economics and psychology, like fields that have where where there's, sort of some difficulties. It's very complex to get good data and to turn it into good models. And he makes the argument that when most people think of history, they think about like reading books and narratives and stuff. And to some degree, like, so part of it is that, there's like an angle, a narrative, depending on who's writing, then they're going to write a certain thing. Um, and but the other side of it also is that to some degree you get something similar to like what very like biologists like 300 or 500 years ago end up with, or during the Middle Ages a biologist would just like sort of make a book, and in the book he would say, this is the lion, this is what it looks like, this is how many legs it has, and you have this huge anthology of like, million, 1,000 different animals. But you're not creating any type of theory about them. And so Darwin comes along, and then you get a theory of this is why life looks the way it does. Um, and so he makes the argument that you should actually think about what the trends are in history and make hypotheses about what the factors and the causal, what the causal interactions are, and then go back and check the data in history and look to see if those data fit together. So this is another chart from the book. This is different variables put together. So this suggests like ways where you can look at the cycle. So you have relative wage, and then you have stature, you have life expectancy, and interestingly, marriage also shows up here. And then you can average these. But the thing is
What's
that
stature? What's the definition of that?
stature is how tall people are.
Okay,
So if
that's
right,
what I
if
was,
you
that's
don't
what I
have,
thought, but it didn't seem, that's
yeah,
really
well,
interesting.
So if yeah, so I mean if and like for example, like when you look at there's some South
Yeah,
American civilization in the period when they're declining, there when you have pressure on the population, they're not getting
sure.
enough to eat, then they don't grow as tall.
Like we see
Um,
in North Korea
yeah, yeah.
compared to South Koreans.
So 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 if you graph these against each other, so this is 1800 to 2000. This is Peter Turchin's data, but according to this data, these things all move together, so they can sort of indicate each other, and you can there's something which you can study in the context of thinking about causal dynamics. This is wealth shares. This is from Ray Dalio. So this is, wealth inequality basically. And wealth inequality is highest around the Great Depression. It goes down to 1980, and then it has been rising since 1980 to the present era. And we're now like basically in the same place as we were around the time of the Great Depression, the two world wars, and there's and the there's certain symptoms of the current era which may be analogous. There is a little bit of conflict in the current era.
Yes, there's a lot of analogies between now and 80 years ago.
Yeah. This is stagnant wages. So wages go up from 1940 to 1980, and then ever since they've been stagnant. That's a fairly famous phenomenon.
And so the actual household income growth that we've seen in the last 40 years is mostly from women joining the workforce, and so the number of people working in the household has gone up, not the average income of the individuals.
Right, not the actual wage price of the labor per hour. Yeah. This is capacity utilization. If you've been following our channel or anything, this is we talk about this a lot. Capacity utilization, has been trending down since 1980. It sort of spikes down and back up during a recession, but the overall trend for 50 years now is just lower and lower. We're now at century lows, similar again to the time of the Great Depression. So I should probably talk about capital consumption theory, the cycle.
So, Eddie, you say that, but now that we're a year away from the start of the pandemic,
yep,
it's rebounded a lot. So we're at the same point as we were.
So that is actually here on this chart. So it spiked down with the pandemic. It's gone up. One thing is that in the last year or so, we got somebody said, I haven't added the numbers myself, but today I heard, and that it seems about right, that a household of four got maybe $11,000 in stimulus money in the last year. Stimulus payments have been wonderful. They are exactly what should be we should be doing. CCT would predict that would be very good for the economy. It has been very good, and it looks a little bit like sort of a recession that was especially like it was really short and we came up very hard. There are some positive signs right now, like the increase tightness of the labor and the rise in, if we're like super lucky, maybe that sparks the upwards, trend of the paradox of the worker consumer. But because the stimulus payments have stopped, I'm not sure that is going to happen. It we might get lucky, but we might not. We might, I think GDP growth, in the last quarter has been a lot slower than it was before, and you may have. And the other thing is that we have asset bubbles and debt expansion holding up spending. So there's, I don't think we're out of the woods, but
no, I'm not saying that. I guess I just wanted to clarify when you said we're at century lows, that it looks like we're at the same point we were in 2018, better than 2010, better than 1983, and about the same as 1975.
Yeah. So our position from a long-term perspective, like 2021 is still lower than sort of 2013, 2018. So the long-term trend seems to be intact so far. And I suspect yeah, it seems to be intact so far. Um, anyways, there may be some people watching us for the first time. So the paradox, the cycle that we're talking about here is based on the paradox of the worker consumer. And I would argue, if anybody is familiar with Peter Turchin's work, Peter Turchin, he continues to look at these variables from past the 1800 to the modern day age, and he finds that the cycle seems to continue. But the period of the cycle seems to have shortened from pre-1800, it was like 300 years, and then post-1800, it's like 80 years. So which is much, much shorter. So I would argue that, the cycles that he has found post-1800 are a different cycle. The ones pre-1800 are Malthusian cycles, and the characteristic time period is determined by the rate of population growth. So it takes 300 years to get from a bottom of population growth to a peak of population growth. Post 1800, agricultural productivity has gone way up, the carrying capacity has gone way up, and we're no longer anywhere near like being in that situation where it is actually a necessity for people to not have enough food. Like, we have plenty of food for everybody. We're nowhere near our carrying capacity, but yet these cycles have continued. And I would argue that what has happened is that the Malthusian cycle has been replaced by the capital consumption cycle. So the capital consumption cycle is based on the paradox of the worker consumer. And what happens is that you have a feedback loop between consumer spending and labor income. So when labor income manages to grow fast enough, what happens is that that causes consumer spending to go up. And when consumer spending goes up, then that means that businesses need labor more, and labor income goes up in the next period. So that causes the growth to be like semi-stable. You get in a semi-stable state where both consumer spending and wages continue to grow. And so that happens from the Great Depression to the 1970s. That's the golden era, as economists call it. And then in the 1970s, you get up to capacity utilization. You actually have spending bumping up against the limits of how much the factories can actually produce. So that gets you capacity constraint inflation during that time. There's a bunch of political changes, and we managed to get off of that cycle. But then the loop operates in the opposite direction, where wages stagnate. And when wages stagnate, then consumer spending is going to stagnate relative to the economy. And so that will cause in the next period for wages to be stagnant again. And so you get this stagnant wages from 1980 to now, and you get capacity utilization going down in a long-term trend from 1980 to now, and you get underutilization across the entire economy, including underutilization of capital and labor. So underutilization of capital you can see in a reduction in the price of capital, which is lowering long-term interest rates. So I have that over here. These are the 10-year treasury rates, historical chart, and you get this beautiful, graph from 1940. Well, this is from 1960 to 1980. These rates are going up. This is higher utilization of capital, and from 1980 to now, it's going down. So that is lower utilization of capital. You're also having, lower utilization of capacity, and lower utilization of labor is visible in those stagnant wages again. So that is in a nutshell. And Brian, you talk a bit about something called the Phoenix cycle. I think we've both read the book The Fourth Turning, which argued that these effects, that they also find these effects. And if you look at history again, and you're being a scientist and you look at the data, some people like hear the word cycle and they think that this is something which is sort of like fringe ideas or something, and they just kind of sweep it away. But if you're actually being a scientist and you look at history and you see that 80 years before us was the world wars in 1940, and then 80 years before that is the Civil War, and then 80 years before that is the American Revolution, and then 80 years before that, I'm not a history buff enough to say at the tip of my tongue, but there's another one before that. Brian knows.
So we were still tied into England's political cycle, and they had
Yeah.
the Glorious Revolution where they deposed the king for a while,
Right.
and 87 years before the Declaration of Independence, they had a Bill of Rights
Yeah.
that they passed.
Interesting. Yeah.
It is, yes.
That would be,
and then
was
80
that,
then 80 years before that would be, is essentially the Mayflower and slavery arriving in
yeah,
America.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah,
So
so I'm
being a
curious
scientist,
about the
like,
long
yeah,
the 300-year cycles that you talked about
yeah.
from Peter Turing's book, right? What historical events do they line up with?
Um, so most of it is like Middle Ages, and again, I'm probably less familiar with it than you are. So I can't, I
Uh,
don't, like
I'll
you're
give you
putting me
credit.
on the spot
You're
here.
more familiar with the Middle
You
Ages
make
than
me-
I am.
Am I? I'm not very familiar with the Middle Ages. But I'll send you the book. They're like 1100 to 1500, and the latest one that he looks at is in Russia, and that cycle I think runs from I don't want to guess, but it runs into the conflict period being the 1900 and the Bolshevik revolution occurring at the crisis point of that cycle.
Well, I guess that was sort of my question is that do his cycles line up with wars? Is that they
Yeah.
are okay?
Yes, they do. They do. And like, and also like he goes back into Roman cycles also, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the cycle, the previous cycle in America, I think of as being the New Deal as opposed to the World Wars, because it really revolutionized the way that our system of government functioned, the
Yeah.
same way that the American Revolution and the Civil War did,
Right.
and wasn't as much the World Wars, although obviously those had a lot to do with getting our productive capacity way up.
Yeah.
I see it more of a government cycle.
Yeah. I mean, the way I see that is that, and it's beginning, it's beginning in 1920. It's not, from 1920 onwards or even 1910 onwards. Um, you have those certain parts of that dynamic are true for a period of time, but you are, from the capital consumption view, you're pushing down on the consumer worker, and the consumer worker is having a harder and harder time. And what happens is that eventually you get to a place where, if you don't do something, like, you're going to have a revolution. And that was sort of threatening to happen. That had happened in Russia. People were worried about it in Europe, and people worried about it in America, and it generates pressure for politicians to finally say, we've got to effing do something. So
So
then you get the New Deal, you get economic reform, and if it's strong enough, then it does bring us out of that section of that cycle.
yeah, so would you say things like the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1937, establishing a 40-hour
Yeah.
work week and minimum
Yep.
wage, things like that,
Absolutely.
that
We,
those
we
addressed?
had Absolutely. We had an 80-hour work week prior to that. And you had all this labor movement, and it came down to 40 hours. When you do that, very roughly speaking, you are reducing labor supply by half. And when you reduce the supply, then that tends to increase the demand. And so that is actually helpful for generating higher wages and higher labor income. When things become scarce, their price goes up. So it is definitely I think, a factor there in helping wages to grow and helping us to come out of that cycle. Yeah, that is a good thing. If we pass a 4-day work week right now, that would be a good thing. That would put pressure on wages to go upwards, while at the same time, giving people a little more of a break.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
so I guess I'm a fan of doing universal basic income instead of mandating that the work week be shorter, and let people decide for themselves,
Yeah,
uh, you know, negotiate for
how much
themselves.
they want to
I
work.
guess, well, so I
I'm
mean, France tried this, I guess it's probably a couple of decades ago, right? Where they mandated a 35-hour work week,
Yep.
and they ended up repealing it after a while. You
Yeah. I don't
have
know
any idea?
anything
Okay.
about
All
that.
right. Just
Um,
curious.
I would be curious why they repealed it. I mean, I'm with you on that. I mean, I think definitely UBI is the, if you had a choice, I think UBI would take priority here. But I do think a 4-hour work week, a 4-day work week, would also actually be a positive thing. It's like OPEC,
Yeah.
like, shutting down the production and saying everybody's gonna double what they pay me for this stuff.
Yeah. So I guess when you say a 40-hour work week, you mean mandate overtime pay after 32 hours? Is that what you're specifically
Yeah,
what you're suggesting?
yeah. I mean, it's not my main thing, but I mean, that's how the 40-hour work week works right now. I mean, you're allowed to work more than 40 hours. Your
Right.
employer is just required to pay you extra for that. So, if it was a 4-day thing, and the employer was required to pay you more, if they wanted more than 4 days out of you, I think that would be a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, we could talk about the economic possibilities for our grandchildren and things like that. But this is interesting. I really, I hadn't heard the predator prey. I hadn't looked at the analogy between that and historical cycles.
Yeah.
There's a good insight. I like it.
Yeah. Well, I hope everybody else enjoyed it also. And we'll see all of you guys in 2 more weeks. Thanks for listening. Capital Consumption Theory. See you guys later.
Uh, crap, I clicked the wrong thing.